Now, before we begin, I want to invite you into a question that has shaped nearly my entire life. And that is, what are the conditions that allow life to flourish? That question has taken me from my own healing journey as a 13-year-old boy to more than 20 years caring for patients in my practices, to conversations with families and athletes, farmers, doctors and scientists, and people whose lives challenge the way I think about health. And the more I've searched, the more convinced I have become of this. Health is not something that we manufacture, and it is not something that we force into the body from the outside. Health emerges when the conditions are right. Those conditions include things like healthy food and movement, sleep, sunlight, nervous system function, relationships, faith, purpose, community, and the soil beneath our feet, as well as the rhythms we live by every single day. Now, my name is Dr. Colin Buck. I want to welcome you to the Vitalist Doc, and let's begin. There are certain moments in life that quietly divide everything into two parts. There is the life you were living before that moment, and then there is the life that begins after it. Most of the time, you don't recognize it while it is actually happening. You're simply inside the experience, trying to make sense of the next thing that is in front of you. But years later, when you look back with a little bit more wisdom, you realize that was the day that everything changed. And for me, that moment came when I was just 13 years old. I woke up one morning, I swung my legs over the bed, and I stood up, looked down, and I noticed that my right knee was swollen. It wasn't enormous, and it wasn't dramatic in the way that sometimes you might imagine in some of these stories, but there also was no pain. But it was certainly obvious that something wasn't right. And as a 13-year-old boy, I was not thinking, well, I wonder what inflammatory process is occurring inside my body. I was thinking, well, that's strange, you know? So I hobbled downstairs and I said, hey, Mom, my right knee's swollen. And she barely looked up. She said, Colin, go upstairs, get dressed, you're going to school. And to be fair to my mother, she knew me. She also knew that if there had been an Olympic event for finding creative ways to avoid school, I probably would be a strong medal contender. So, mind, this may have just been my latest attempt to stay home from school. So off I went. And the next morning I woke up, looked down, and now both knees were swollen. Again, there was no pain, just a strange, heavy feeling of swelling. And that feeling that your joints they're not quite yours, that sense that something inside the body has changed and you can't explain yet what it is. And I remember thinking, well, this is not exactly moving in the right direction. So again, I hobbled down the stairs. I said, hey, Mom, my other knee is swollen as well. And this time she paused, she looked at me, she thought for a moment, and then she said, Colin, you're still going to school. So I'm sure I was not particularly impressed with her answer at that moment in time. And of course I went, and then came day 3. And at that moment is when I believe everything changed, because you see, I had both swollen knees and both my ankles were swollen. And still at this point, there was no pain. It was more a feeling of my body was simply just not working properly. My joints felt full, restricted, heavy. They were just wrong. And then came the part that made it impossible to dismiss. I actually couldn't walk. And I remember sitting at the top of the stairs, looking down and realizing that the only way down was to go down on my backside. So that is exactly what I did. I came down the stairs like that, slowly, awkwardly, and probably a little bit confused more than anything else. And, because when you're a 13-year-old boy, you don't immediately start to think that your life is going to change. You just know something is happening that shouldn't be happening. And then I looked up and saw my mother's face. The determination was still there because that was who my mother was. But now there was something else. There was concern, real concern, the kind of concern that only a parent can understand. And that moment is when something, different is going on and it's not going away. And she stayed remarkably calm, but the tone changed. She said, go back upstairs and get into bed, Colin. And then she picked up the phone and she called our family medical doctor. And later that afternoon, he came to our house. After examining me, explained that he was concerned about a condition called rheumatic fever, which is a condition of the heart that requires urgent attention and immediate investigation. And the next day we got the call that I was to be admitted to the hospital. Just lying there in that hospital bed from that moment until the day I was diagnosed, things just changed. The concern was my heart, and I was not allowed to do anything that could create any type of exertion. Nothing. I was not allowed to move around. I was not allowed to be active. I was not allowed to do normal things that a 13-year-old boy does without even thinking. I'd gone from being a young boy with energy and moving all the time and playing sports to lying in a hospital bed because they were trying to protect my heart. And I understand why they did it. They were being careful. They were doing what they believed was necessary. But while they were trying everything to protect my heart, my body was slowly wilting away. And day after day in the hospital bed, I could feel myself getting weaker, and my muscles just began to disappear. My strength drained out of me, and I was not running and climbing and playing and moving or using my body. I was just lying there waiting and waiting. And waiting does something to you. I remember that strange feeling of watching my body change, not from pain, but from inactivity, from being held still, from muscle atrophy, from loss of strength that happens when a living body is no longer allowed to live the way it was designed to live. And what followed was about 30 days of blood tests and specialists and needles and questions and just waiting, a lot of waiting. I never had a deep fear I was not going to get well. I do not remember lying there believing that my life was over. I do not remember feeling hopeless, but I was frustrated. I was bored. I was confused. I was getting weaker, but somewhere inside of me, even then, there was this quiet assumption that I would just come back from it. I did not have the language for it at the time, but looking back, I think some part of me still trusted in life. And some part of me believed that the body was capable of finding its way back. And looking back, for me, the greatest lesson I learned in that hospital wasn't really about medicine, but it was about people. My mother was working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, and yet somehow she still found ways to be there every day, and even sometimes 3 times a day. My sister visited with me every single day, and my dad, my grandparents, my cousins, friends, and extended family in our community, and especially my cousin Chantal. She spent hours sitting with me, reading to me while I was bored and frustrated and just trying to understand what was happening in my life. At 13 years old, lying in a hospital bed, I discovered something I would only fully understand decades later. And that was health is never just an individual experience. When one person suffers, an entire family feels it, an entire community quietly carries that burden. Families do not simply watch illness from the outside, they live it together. And that lesson has stayed with me for the rest of my life. Eventually, after test after test and specialist after specialist, my parents got an answer. It was juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And I remember my parents asking what any parent would ask, and that was, so what happens next? The specialist began explaining the treatment plan. We'll begin with cortisone. I remember that. And at that moment in time, my brave parents didn't even let him finish the sentence. They just turned and looked at each other. And my mother and father said at the same time, that will eat his bones, and that will be so damaging to his organs. And, there was no anger in the room. There was no confrontation. They were not trying to be difficult. They were not trying to prove anyone wrong. They simply were 2 parents trying to make the best decision that they could for their own son. And they were so brave. They thanked the doctors sincerely, and they asked for time to sit as a family and talk about this and make a decision together. And the doctors respected that. And looking back now as a father, a healthcare professional, I have enormous respect for that decision, because it would have been much easier for my parents to simply nod, accept the recommendations, and move forward. And that would have been an understandable thing to do. But in many ways, it would have been the easiest thing to do, but instead they accepted the weight of asking a different question, one that I believe changed my entire life. And when you are a parent, that is not a small thing. I'm sure friends and family thought that they were crazy, that they were making a big mistake. Why would you question the specialist? Why would you consider another path? Why would you take a child out of a hospital when there actually is a plan already laid out for him? But you see, I grew up in a family that viewed health differently. We didn't have medicine cabinets, with medicine in. Natural health was not something that we discovered later because it became fashionable. It was something that was just a part of how my family lived. My father experienced chiropractic very early on in his cycling career, and years of racing and years of crashes, years of pushing my dad's body to the limits taught him something about chiropractic, and it helped him recover from injuries, and it helped him realize something much deeper. He felt his body function better, and he breathed better, and he recovered better, and he rode stronger when he was under chiropractic. He may not have had the scientific language at the time, but he knew something changed when his nervous system was functioning well and his body was getting adjusted. So after talking together, my parents made the decision. They literally picked me up and carried me out of the hospital, and they took me to their chiropractor. Now, at 13 years old, I thought they were simply taking me somewhere different. I had no idea they were changing the direction of my entire life, because for the first time, I encountered a different question. And the question wasn't, what is wrong with this boy? The question was, it was, what is preventing this boy's body from doing exactly what it's designed to do? And that was amazing to me and to my family. And that question has followed me for 40 years. It has shaped the chiropractor I became. It shaped the father I became. It shaped the way I cared for every patient that has ever sat across from me. It shaped the book I've written and the documentaries I want to film, the conversations that I want to have, and the message I feel called to share with the world, because that experience taught me something that became the foundation of my life's work, that the body is not random, it's not stupid, and that the body is simply not a collection of parts waiting to be broken down. The body's intelligence, it's adaptive, it's always listening, always responding, and always trying to move toward life, balance, healing, and survival based on the conditions that it's living in. And when we stop seeing the body as the enemy, when we stop asking only how to silence symptoms, and we begin asking what conditions are interfering with life expressing itself fully, everything changes. That is the question that started everything for me. What are the conditions that allow life to flourish? That question has never left me, and ultimately it is the reason that the Vitalist Doc now exists. Now, I honestly wish that I could tell you that walking out of that chiropractor's office was the end of the story, but it wasn't. In many ways, it was actually just the beginning. At 13 years old, I did not suddenly understand the nervous system. I did not understand physiology. I certainly could not have explained the immune system and inflammation, adaptation, or healing. I was still just a young boy trying to make sense of what had happened to me. But I knew something had changed. Something inside me had shifted, not physically, but in the way I saw the body. I could not explain it at the time, but somewhere in the background of my mind, a question had been planted. Why had my life changed? Because someone looked at my body differently. Why had one person asked a completely different question from everyone else? Why did it matter so much that the question changed from what is wrong with this boy to what is preventing this boy's body from doing what it was designed to do? I did not have the language for it then, but that question never really left me. It followed me through high school, onto the soccer field. It followed me into cycling. It followed me into adulthood. And eventually it followed me into chiropractic university. And people sometimes ask me why I became a chiropractor. And the honest answer is that I'm not sure I ever really chose chiropractic. I believe chiropractic chose me. How could it not have? The experience I had at 13 had left a mark on me that never has disappeared. Not a wound exactly, more like a calling, something I needed to understand that I had to live through, not because I was trying to prove my parents right, not because I wanted to defend chiropractic, not because I needed to win an argument with anyone. I simply wanted to understand what had happened inside my body. Why had the question changed everything? Why did looking at the body through a different lens seem to open a door that had not opened before? And that curiosity shaped my education, it shaped my career, and eventually it shaped the way I looked at every patient who walked through the door. And over the next 20 years, I had the privilege of caring for thousands of people. We're talking about babies and young children and professional athletes, pregnant mothers and grandparents and business owners and people struggling with chronic pain and battling digestive issues and fatigue and anxiety and infections and autoimmune conditions and symptoms they could not quite explain, but someone told them, go see Dr. Colin. Everything that they had tried was not working. Others came because they just did not know where else to turn. Their symptoms weren't different. Their stories were different. Their lives were different. But after a while, I began noticing something remarkable. The question I found myself asking was never, what disease does this person have? What do we need to treat? The question was always, what might be interfering with this person's ability to function the way they were designed to function? And that changed everything. Sometimes the interference was physical, sometimes nutritional, sometimes it was chronic stress or poor sleep, sometimes it was an emotional trauma or loneliness, disconnection, or years living in survival mode. Sometimes it was the body that had been pushed far too long without any recovery. And sometimes it was the nervous system that had forgotten what safety looked like. Sometimes it was a person who had been told for years that nothing was wrong, even though everything inside of them was saying otherwise. The form of the interference changed from person to person, but the principle, it never did. The body was always adapting, always listening, always responding to the conditions it had been given. And the more people I cared for, the more convinced I became that health was not about fixing broken parts. That model felt too small for me, too mechanical, too incomplete for what I was seeing and experiencing every single day. Health seemed to emerge when the conditions were right, always. Not forced, not manufactured, not imposed from the outside. Allowed, supported, restored. The human body, when given the right conditions, always has this extraordinary capacity to move back towards balance, repair, resilience in life. At the time, I did not have the perfect language to explain it, but I just kept seeing it over and over again. A child began sleeping better after months of struggle. A mother's digestion improved when her nervous system finally began to calm. An athlete recovered, not because we addressed the injury, but because we addressed the system that had been carrying the stress of training and pressure and travel and expectation. A person who had spent years feeling betrayed by their own body realized maybe their body had been trying to protect them all along. These moments stayed with me. They reminded me of my own story. They reminded me of the hospital bed, of the atrophy, the waiting, the diagnosis, my parents' amazing decision, and that first encounter with a different question. And then, many years later, I picked up a book about a farm in southern England. I thought I was about to read a story about agriculture, and I had no idea I was about to find the words for something I had been witnessing in the human body for so many years, for decades, in fact. Because what I found in that story was not just a lesson about farming. It was a lesson about life. It was a lesson about soil and ecosystems and resilience and the conditions that allow living things to flourish. And as I read, I kept thinking, this is exactly what I've been seeing in people for the last 2 decades. The farm didn't heal because someone forced it to heal. It healed because they changed the conditions. The soil came back to life because the environment began supporting life again. And that was the moment the question that had followed me since I was 13 became more clear than ever. What if the human body is not so different? What if healing is not only about attacking symptoms, suppressing signals, or forcing the body into submission? What if healing begins when we ask a better question? What are the conditions that allow life to flourish? That question has become the foundation of everything I do. It is the thread that connects my childhood story, my work as a chiropractor, my understanding of the nervous system, my view of gut health, my respect of nature, and the philosophy behind the Vitalist Doc. Because I do not believe the body is broken by default. I believe the body is intelligent. I believe the body is adaptive. I believe it is always responding to the environment around it and within it. And I believe when we remove interference and restore conditions for life, something remarkable is always possible. So when I picked up this book about the farm, and I know what some people might be thinking, wait a second, I thought this podcast was about health. I thought it was about the body. I thought it was about healing. And so did I. But one of the things I have come to believe over the years is that some of the greatest lessons about the human body do not always come from studying the human body directly. Sometimes they come from looking at nature and observing it, because nature has a way of revealing the truth without trying to explain it. The farm was called Knepp. It was in West Sussex, England, and it covers roughly 3,500 acres. The farm was owned by Charlie Burrell. And for years, Charlie had done what most people would have considered the responsible thing. He followed the advice. He listened to the experts. He fertilized the land. He sprayed. He drained the wetlands. He planted the recommended crops. He used modern farming methods. He worked hard. He invested time, energy, money, effort into doing everything the system told him he was supposed to do. And yet, despite doing everything right, the land continued to struggle. The soil became exhausted. The biodiversity disappeared. The farm became harder and harder to sustain financially, ecologically, and emotionally. Everything seemed to be moving in the wrong direction. And I think that is the part of the story that first grabbed me, because how many people feel the same way about their health? They are doing what they were told to do. They are following the recommendations. They are taking the medication. They are trying the diet. They are adding the supplement. They are adding everything that sounds responsible. And yet, deep down, they feel like life is still draining out of them. That is what struck me as I read the story of this farm. Eventually, Charlie made a decision that many people thought was completely irresponsible, just like my own parents. He stopped. He stopped trying to force the land to produce. He stopped trying to control every variable. He stopped trying to make a struggling ecosystem behave like a healthy one through more pressure, more intervention, and more control. He sold much of the heavy equipment. He then stopped the intensive farming and he just allowed the land to breathe. He allowed grazing animals to move across the land in a more natural way, and he removed the interference, and then he just waited. This part is the important part, because nothing in nature happens outside of the process of time. There is no miracle overnight. There was no dramatic transformation in a week. There was no instant before and after photograph. For a while, it probably looked like nothing was happening at all, but beneath the surface, something was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the land began to respond. The wildflowers returned, the insects returned, and then the butterflies, and then the birds. Species that had not been seen there for decades began to reappear. The soil began to come alive again. Scientists and observers came to study what had happened, because what they were seeing challenged many assumptions about land management, control, and restoration. And as I read that story, I had one of those moments where you put the book down, sit quietly, and just stare into space. Because I was not thinking about farming anymore. I was thinking about people. I was thinking about the patients I had cared for more than 20 years. I was thinking about the children, the mothers, the athletes, the exhausted fathers, the people with digestive issues, the people with anxiety, the people who had been told nothing was wrong, and yet they knew something was not right. And I realized I'd been watching the same principle play out in the human body again and again and again. Not because I was healing anybody. I want to be very clear about that. I have never believed that I heal people. The body heals, life heals, the intelligence within us heals. My role has always been much more humble than that. My role has been to ask a better question. What might be getting in the way? What interference is this person living under? What conditions is this body been trying to adapt to for weeks, months, years, and even decades? Because over and over again, I had watched people begin to change, not because we manufactured health, but because we had helped them create better conditions for health to emerge. Sometimes that meant restoring movement to the spine and improving the communication pathways in the nervous system. Sometimes it meant helping someone sleep again. Sometimes it meant reducing the burden of chronic stress. Sometimes it meant changing food, not as punishment, but as nourishment. And sometimes it meant helping a person breathe and walk and rest and recover and reconnect with life and nature. Sometimes it meant helping them understand that their body was not their enemy. The details were different. The principle was always the same. The body was always responding to the conditions it had been given. That is intelligence. And that is what the farm helped me see with such clarity. Charlie Burrell had not built the ecosystem by force. He had not manufactured biodiversity. He had not engineered life back into the soil with some clever trick. He simply removed enough interference for nature to begin to do what nature has always done. And I remember thinking, that's it. That is what I had been doing for 20 years. Health is not something that we install, and it is not something that we force into the body from the outside. It is something that emerges when the conditions are right. Every time. When the conditions are right, life moves towards life. Whether we are talking about a forest, a farm, a gut, a nervous system, a child, a mother, an athlete, or a human being who has forgotten what it feels like to be well. Now, let me be clear here, because life is more complicated than a slogan. This does not mean every sick person gets well. It does not mean disease does not exist, and it does not mean genetics don't matter. It doesn't mean trauma does not leave marks. It doesn't mean that medicine has no role. There are certainly times when medical care is essential and necessary and life-saving. But it does mean something incredibly important. Maybe one of the most powerful questions we can ask is not, what do I need to add? But rather, what do I need to remove? What is blocking life? What is blocking healing? What is overwhelming the system? And what is exhausting the soil? What is interfering with the body's ability to express the intelligence it was designed with? That single idea changed the way I thought about everything. Food was no longer just about calories. It was about information, and movement was no longer just about exercise. It was communication. Sleep was not just rest. It was restoration, and stress was no longer just an emotion. It was a biological environment. Relationships were no longer separate from health. They were part of the conditions in which the body lives. Purpose was no longer a luxury. It was part of what tells the body there is a reason to keep moving toward life. Even parenting changed for me, because I began to see that the deepest work is not always forcing, pushing, controlling, or correcting every outcome. Sometimes the deepest work is in creating the conditions where life is the greatest opportunity to rise. And once I saw that pattern, I could not stop seeing it over and over and over. It was everywhere. It was in the soil. It was in the nervous system. It was in the gut. It was in families. It was in communities. It was in healing. It was in the quiet resilience of the human body. The farm had given me language for something I had felt since I was 13 years old, something I had witnessed in the practice for decades, and something I now believe sits at the very heart of health. Life does not need to be forced into existence. Life needs the conditions that allow it to flourish. And that realization eventually led me to another story. And it wasn't about a farm this time. It was actually about a medical doctor, a doctor whose courage to ask difficult questions would challenge the way I think about the modern healthcare system. I think a lot has to do with having the courage to ask the different questions. And after reading about NEP, I could not stop thinking about it. The story stayed with me because it gave language to something I had been seeing in people for over 20 years. If a farm could come back to life when the interference was removed, and if I watched human beings begin to change when the conditions around them changed, then I began to wonder where else that principle might appear. Where else had we become so focused on adding, controlling, managing, and intervening that we had forgotten to ask what might be getting in the way? And so that search eventually led me to a Danish physician named Dr. Getchke. Now, Dr. Getchke is often described as controversial, but I think we need to pause here for a moment, because in modern healthcare, anyone who seriously challenges the dominant medical narrative is almost always going to be called controversial. That does not automatically make them right, but it does not automatically make them wrong. Sometimes a person becomes controversial not because they are reckless, but because they are willing to ask questions that powerful systems do not want asked. And that interested me. Now, Dr. Getchka was not some random outsider throwing stones at medicine from a distance. He was actually a medical physician, a researcher, one of the co-founders of the Cochrane collaboration, and the founder of the Nordic Cochrane Center. Cochrane was created to bring greater honesty and rigor and independence to medical evidence, to examine the research carefully and ask whether the evidence really supported the claims being made. And that matters, because one of the things medicine says it values most is evidence. But what happens when the evidence begins asking uncomfortable questions? What happens when someone looks not only at the benefits of treatment, but also at the harm that can occur when treatment becomes excessive, automatic, or lifelong without anyone stepping back to reassess? What happens when someone asks whether some people are being medicated not because their bodies are lacking medicine, but because the deeper conditions of their lives have never been addressed? That is the question that caught my attention, because at the heart of his work was something very simple and very powerful. What happens when we keep adding without ever asking what could be removed? Now, I want to be clear. My job is not to treat your condition. My job is not to tell you that you should or should not take a medication. That is between you and your prescribing physician. It has nothing to do with me. And if you are taking medication, you should never stop it suddenly or irresponsibly because of something you heard in a podcast or read in a book or saw online. That is not wisdom, and that is not vitalism. That is not responsible healthcare. But I do believe we need to be honest enough to say something out loud. Medicine is not a lifestyle. It has a place. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it is life-saving. Sometimes it is exactly the right tool at the exact right time. If someone has a severe bacterial infection, well, I'm grateful for antibiotics. If someone is in a serious car accident, I want them to have emergency medicine. And if someone has a heart attack or a stroke or a life-threatening crisis, I want the best of modern medicine to be available to them. Modern medicine has certainly saved countless lives, and I never want anyone to mistake my respect for vitalistic healthcare as rejection for medicine. It is not. But medicine was never meant to become a substitute for living in a way that supports health. It was never meant to replace sleep. It was never meant to replace movement. It was never meant to replace real healthy food. It was never meant to replace sunlight, connection, breath, purpose, community, faith, responsibility, and the daily conditions that would allow the body to function the way it was designed to function. And yet, if we are to be honest, that is what has happened for many people. Medicine has become a lifestyle, not because people are bad, not because doctors are bad, not because patients are lazy, but because the system is often built to manage the consequences of dysfunction far more than it is built to help people restore the conditions for health. We have become very good at adding another prescription, another supplement or peptide, another test or procedure, another protocol, another label, another diagnosis, another thing to manage the last thing. But somewhere along the way, we stopped asking a much simpler and often more profound question, and that is, what is getting in the way? What is interfering with this person's ability to function, adapt, regulate, heal, and live the way they were designed to live? Because if something is interfering, perhaps that is where the conversation should begin. And over the years, I've seen so many people desperately searching for the next answer, the next supplement, the next diet, the next hormone or lab test, or the next expert, the next biohack, the next thing that will finally fix them. And I understand that search. When people are suffering, they want answers, they want relief, they want hope, they want someone to tell them what to do next. But very often, while they are searching for the next thing to add, the conditions of their life are quietly telling a different story. They are sleeping 5 hours a night. They are living under relentless stress. They are eating highly processed junk food, and they rarely see the sun. They barely move. They don't truly rest, and they shallow breathe. They eat unhealthy. They are disconnected from family and from purpose and from community, and they are disconnected from the rhythms that human beings were designed to live by. And then the body begins to struggle. The gut struggles, the nervous system struggles, the hormones struggle, the immune system struggles, the mind struggles. And instead of asking what conditions have created this state, we often ask, well, what medication or supplement or intervention can suppress the signal? Again, there are times when that is absolutely necessary, but it cannot be the whole conversation, because my philosophy does not begin with treating conditions. It begins with restoring balance to the environment in which the body is trying to function. That is the very different thing. I am not asking, how do I treat this diagnosis? I am asking, what conditions has this body been living in? What has the nervous system been adapting to? What has the gut been exposed to? What has the immune system been responding to intelligently? What has this person been carrying physically, chemically, emotionally, and spiritually? What has been added that may be overwhelming the system, and what could be removed so that life has more room to express life? That is why the work of people willing to challenge medical assumptions matters to me, not because I agree with every conclusion and not because I believe only one person has all the answers, but because courage matters. It takes courage to ask whether more is always better. It takes courage to ask whether lifelong management is always the highest goal. It takes courage to ask whether the body may be more capable than we have been taught to believe. And it takes courage to ask whether some people are not suffering because they need more things added, but because too many things are standing in the way. That question has completely changed the way I look at health. I have never begun with asking, what can I add? I begin asking, what can we remove? Can we remove chronic stress? Can we remove ultra-processed food? Can we remove unnecessary fear or interference to the brain's ability to communicate? Can we remove the belief that the body is broken? Can we remove isolation? Can we remove constant noise that keeps the nervous system living in survival mode? Can we remove the habits, burdens, and patterns that slowly drain life? Can we remove interference? Because something extraordinary can and will happen when interference is removed. Not always, not perfectly, not instantly. Life is too complex for shallow promises. But over and over again, living systems show us something remarkable. When the conditions improve, life begins moving towards life again. A forest can recover after decades of being depleted. A farm can come alive after years of being forced beyond its capacity. A person can begin sleeping through the night. A family can begin eating together. A man can begin to feel his vitality return. A child can begin to feel safe in their own body. A nervous system can begin to come out of survival mode, and a body can begin to express more of the intelligence that was there all along. That is why I do not think of myself as someone who fixes people. Honestly, I think that is far too much responsibility. I do not heal people. The body heals, life heals, the intelligence within the body heals, and my role is much humbler than that. I've spent my life searching for the conditions that allow healing to become possible, and I have never stopped asking that question because I still believe it may be one of the most important questions we can ask. Not what is broken, but what is getting in the way. And once I truly saw that, I began seeing the same principle everywhere. I saw it in men who had lost their vitality. I saw it in children who were afraid of their own bodies. I saw it in families who had forgotten how to live together. I saw it in the food we eat. I saw it in the soil beneath our feet, and I saw it in the nervous system. I saw it in the gut. I saw it in the way we parent. I saw it in the way we raise boys. I saw it in the way modern life teaches people to be or live disconnected from the conditions that the body requires in order to flourish. And suddenly everything I had spent my life doing began to fit together. It was not a collection of separate interests. It was one story, one thread, one mission, one lifelong search. What are the conditions that allow life to flourish? That question began when I was 13 years old, a boy carried out of hospital And now it has become the foundation of the Vitalist Doc, because I believe we are living in a time where people desperately need to remember something. The body is not the enemy. Symptoms are not betrayal signals. Medicine has a place, but medicine is not a way of life. So I want to move to where this search has taken me. When I look back over the last 40 years, it is remarkable to me how one simple question has shaped quietly almost every major part of my life. Not because I planned it that way. I did not sit down at 13 years old and map out some grand philosophy. I did not know I would become a chiropractor. I did not know I would spend my life studying the nervous system and health and families, men, children, food, farming, or the deeper patterns of life. Life just kept leading me back to the same question. And the question always is, what are the conditions that allow life to flourish? And once that question became clearer to me, I started seeing it everywhere. I saw it in the clinic. I saw it in my own family, on the farms, with children, older people that seemed to age with remarkable vitality. I saw it in athletes and in people who had lost their way. I saw it in cultures that somehow held on to the rhythms that modern life has almost forgotten. And eventually I realized something that changed everything for me. All the things I cared about were not separate. They were one conversation, just viewed through different windows. Take the gut, for example. People often ask me, what is the best probiotic? What is the supplement I should take? And I certainly understand why they ask that. We live in a world that has trained us to look for the next product, the next pill, the next powder, the next thing to add. But my answer often disappoints people at first, because I do not believe the gut is simply a pipe that needs another product poured into it. I think the gut is much closer to a rainforest, to a living ecosystem, trillions of organisms constantly in communication, constantly adapting, and with constant intelligence. When a rainforest is healthy, life flourishes, and there is diversity, resilience, rhythm, and there is balance. But when it is repeatedly damaged, stripped, sprayed, stressed, and disturbed, life begins to struggle. And the answer is not always to add something new. Sometimes the answer begins by stopping the things that keep destroying the ecosystem. Now, that is exactly why I am writing the book, Reclaim Your Gut. Not to sell another miracle, not to convince people that there is one magic supplement, and not to reduce gut health to a trendy protocol. I'm writing it because I want people to understand how to create the conditions that allow their internal ecosystem to recover. Food matters, sleep matters, stress matters, the nervous system matters, movement matters, sunlight, microbial diversity, the way you eat matters, the way you breathe matters, the way you live matters. Different landscape, same question. What are the conditions that allow life to flourish? And then there is family. People sometimes ask me, what did you do differently with your boys? And the truth is, my wife and I, we weren't trying to raise extraordinary children. We were simply trying to create and protect the conditions that allow children to flourish. We wanted our home to be an environment that worked with human biology instead of constantly fighting against it. Real healthy food, real movement, real sleep, time outdoors, sport, faith, responsibility, conversations at the dinner table, love, discipline, laughter, challenge, and a sense of purpose. Did we get everything right? Not even close. Like every parent, we made mistakes, many of them, and we're still making them. There are things I would probably do differently now with the wisdom of time, but we kept coming back to one question. What environment are we creating inside our home? Because children don't simply listen to what we say. They absorb the conditions that we create. They absorb the rhythm of the home. They absorb the way we handle stress and the way we absorb food and what we normalize, the conversations we have, the values we live by, the way we respond to challenge, the way we speak about the body, health, discipline, faith, and life. Today, my boys, they've grown up to be amazing young men. One is chasing his dream of becoming a professional footballer, and the other is pursuing a future in economics and public service. And am I proud of them? Man, more than I can put into words. But not just because of what they are doing. I am proud of who they are becoming: kind, curious, disciplined, grounded, respectful, and strong. I do not believe that happens because of accidents. I believe environments matter. And that is why I'm building the program about family health, not because families need another parenting book or a set of rules. Families need hope. They need practical ways to create homes where health, connection, character, faith, strength, and love have a room to grow. And again, it's the same principle, just a different landscape. And then there's young men. And this one to me is deeply personal because I believe we have reached a moment in the history where many boys are genuinely confused about what strength means. And some of them think strength means aggression, or that it's bad, or that it's never showing emotion, or something strength means dominance. Others have been taught that masculinity itself is something to apologize for. And I do not believe any of those things. I believe real strength begins much earlier and much deeper than that. It begins with character, discipline, responsibility, humility, faith, service, and purpose. A body that has been challenged and a mind that continues learning. A heart that remains kind. The ability to do hard things and the willingness to protect, provide, serve, build, lead, and love. Those things happen not by accident. They are cultivated slowly, patiently, and over the years. One conversation at a time, one meal at a time, one challenge at a time, one example at a time. And that is why I'm creating the Young Strong Men program, because I do not believe the next generation simply needs more information. They need mentors, they need fathers, they need coaches, and they need teachers. They need men willing to show them what strength actually looks like. Not perfection, character, not ego, responsibility, and not domination, service. Not emotional weakness disguised as toughness, but real strength, the kind that can carry weight without becoming cruel, the kind that can lead without applause, the kind that can love without losing itself. Same principle, another landscape. And then there's men's health. Over more than 20 years in practice, I have watched too many men slowly disappear, not physically, at least not at first, emotionally, spiritually, and energetically. They keep providing, they keep working, they keep pushing through, they keep carrying responsibility, they keep saying, I'm fine, because it is what they're taught to say. And then one day they wake up and realize they no longer recognize themselves. Their energy is gone, their joy is fading, their body feels heavy, their purpose feels distant, their marriage may feel disconnected, their faith may feel thin, their health may be slipping. And many simply assume this must just be getting older. But I do not believe that is the whole story. I believe many men have spent years living in environments that slowly extinguish vitality, poor sleep, poor food, constant stress, isolation, disconnection. No mission, no brotherhood, no recovery, no silence, no sunlight, and no meaningful challenge. No place where they can be honest about the weight they are carrying. Again, the symptoms may look different, but the question is the same. What conditions allow a man to come fully alive? That is the conversation I want to have every single week, because I believe men are not finished. They are not washed up. They are not destined to fade quietly into fatigue and frustration and disconnection, but they do need the right conditions. They need rhythm, they need strength, and they need brotherhood. They need responsibility, and they need purpose, and of course, they need faith. They need to recover their bodies, their minds, their families, and their mission. And then there is something else that has been growing inside of me, something bigger than books, bigger than courses, bigger than newsletters, bigger than social media. I do not just want to talk about these ideas anymore. I want to go and actually see them. I want to visit regenerative farms and walk in the fields. I want to stand in healthy soil. I want to meet the farmers who have watched the dead land come back to life. I want to sit with people who still understand rhythms that the modern world has forgotten. I want to ride my bicycle across countries and visit remarkable human beings, not celebrities. The shepherd who has lived 98 extraordinary years, the farmer whose family has worked the same land for generations, the grandmother who still cooks the way her mother taught her, the village where people still gather around tables instead of televisions, the community that has quietly protected something the rest of the world forgot, the athlete who discovered performance is just not working harder, but it's living better. The father who rebuilt his family, the man who found his purpose again, the doctor, the farmer, the teacher, the coach, the mother and elder, who all in their own way have discovered something about life that is worth listening to. And I want to ask them all the same question. What creates the conditions for life to flourish? Because I have a suspicion the answers will not be all exactly the same, but I think they will rhyme. Movement, purpose, community, faith, nature, good food, meaningful work, laughter, belonging, responsibility, love. And not because those things are fashionable, not because they are a part of the latest wellness trend, but because they are deeply human, they are ancient, they're biblical, they are biological, and they are spiritual. They are the conditions human beings have always needed in order to become fully alive. That is why the Vitalist Doc exists. Not because I have all the answers. I do not. Far from it. The older I get, the more I realize how much there still is to learn. And this podcast, this platform, these books, these documentaries, this entire movement, it is not really me standing above anyone pretending to have figured everything out. It is me inviting you to come searching with me, to ask better questions, to look at the body differently, to look at health differently, to look at families, men, children, food, soil, faith, movement, and life itself through a different lens, because I honestly believe that the greatest discoveries still lie ahead. And I have a feeling we are going to find many of them together. One farm, one family, one story, one conversation, one life at a time, always returning to the same question: what are the conditions that allow life to flourish? I want to thank you for joining me. If today's conversation made you see your body, your health, or even your life a little differently, then we've accomplished exactly what this podcast is here to do. If you know someone who would benefit from the conversation, I'd be grateful if you shared it with them. And if you'd like to continue the journey, you can join my weekly newsletter where I can go deeper into the ideas we explore here and share what I'm discovering along the way. Until next time, keep asking better questions, keep creating better conditions, and never stop searching for the conditions that allow life to flourish. I'm Dr. Colin Buck. This is the Vitalist Doc. Now, before you go, I'd like to leave you with one important reminder. Everything we discuss on this podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. It reflects my experience as a chiropractor, my clinical observations over more than 20 years in practice, my study of the scientific literature, and my personal philosophy of vitalistic health. Nothing on this podcast is intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease, nor should it replace the advice, diagnosis, or treatment provided by your physician or another qualified healthcare professional. Every person is unique and every health journey is different. Before making significant changes to your healthcare medications, diet, supplements, or exercise, please consult with a qualified healthcare professional who understands your individual circumstances. My hope is not to tell you what to think. It is to encourage you to ask better questions, to become curious about your health, and to better understand the remarkable intelligence built into the human body. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.